Hey there, my name is Eric and this is Delve, the official thought leadership podcast of the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University. So I'm a journalist and producer in Montreal, and today I'm talking to Professor Saku Mantere.
Expecting a company to be, or any organization to be constantly innovative or creative, there are such, I'm sure that, there are radical examples, but I don't think it's a fair expectation for any of us. That said, an amount of creativity arguably is essential for any type of work.
So you might be familiar with that voice. Saku is actually my editor-in-chief, and he's conducted plenty of interviews for the podcast before. But what you might not know is that he's an expert on creativity. He's a jazz musician, a creative writer, and most of all, he's just a fan of all things artistic. But more than that, he's a student of creativity, and he's actually teaching a course on it to undergraduate students here at McGill University. So today, he's in a hot seat, and together we're going to explore his 6 core principles of creativity, how we can practice being more creative ourselves, and what creativity can look like when we bring it to work with us. So as always, if you have any questions or feedback about the show, send us an email. We're at delve@mcgill.ca. Or if social media is more your thing, send us a message on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. And why not follow us while you're there? So all right, let's delve into it. So Saku Mantere, thank you so much for joining us today. How does it feel? How does it feel to be in the hot seat? I feel like this is unusual for you.
Well, it seems that I am surprisingly relaxed.
Oh, that's good.
It's easier to be asked questions than asking them.
You know what? I think there's a lot of people who disagree with you. But
okay.
Yeah. But I'm glad you're comfortable. So the reason why we're speaking today, we're talking about creativity, and you've been thinking about it a lot. You're teaching a course on the subject, and I think there's a lot of relevance here. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what creativity is and how it works.
Right.
So I'm excited to sort of pick your brain on it and sort of get your take on what creativity is. So just thinking about my first question, I guess maybe we could just start at a very high level. Just what does it mean? What does it mean to be a creative person? Because I think it's more complicated than we might realize.
Yeah, so I started thinking about creativity a couple of years ago because I had this creative urge myself that I was kind of at the midpoint of my life. I realized that I had a bit of a midlife crisis, and I was professionally secure. I had tenure here at McGill, and I was pretty much where I'd wanted to be academically. And then there was this itch that I wanted to come back to music. That was my original sort of passion when I was growing up. It seems that my life kind of needed this creative component, even though research is pretty creative, teaching is creative. But then I've been preoccupied with this question: why did that happen? And then there was an opportunity for this year. A colleague of mine is on sabbatical, so there was a course on creativity for MBAs and our master students. And I figured that I'd do it for a year and sort of design a course on creativity so that I could understand what it was. So this is a long segue to your question, what is it? So I've been reading up on a lot of literature. I tend to want to read pretty broadly when I try to understand something. And I've been reading up on psychology and philosophy, aesthetics, economics, all these different sort of major fields that have some take on creativity. And it seems that there's 6 different ways of understanding it, which I'm now sort of founding the course on as well that I'm teaching. So it's helped me to kind of give a solid foundation for the work for the students to understand it. So basically, creativity is 6 different things. Are you ready to hear what they are?
Yeah. So it sounds like it's more than just a stroke of inspiration and I'm going to sit at my computer and write a song. Hit me with the 6 different types.
Okay, so one way to look at creativity is to look into biology. So what is it that an animal does when its stomach is full and it's more or less safe? So it starts messing around. So there's a what is it that kids do when they're feeling safe and secure? They play. So creativity is this sort of notion of or it's a practice that is playful. So that's the first one. The second one is meaning and identity. So, it's creativity is channeling who we are, how we are unique in this lonely, unjust and unfair world, and how do we, psychologist Rollo May talks about the courage to create is that it is kind of, it's to fight injustice, and the greatest injustice is death itself. That's sort of, our mortality. We are raging against the dying of the light, as Dylan Thomas put it. We're accessing meaning and our identity, sort of expressing our uniqueness by creativity. So that's the second thing. Do those make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm following. Yeah.
Okay, so play and meaning, those are the first two. Then the third one is we shift gears totally. We go to Adam Smith, we go to economics, and we think about competition. Creativity is something that's actually driven by a competitive market. So, or Schumpeter, the great economist, was talking about creative destruction, that sort of forces of capitalism are driving this relentless competition that sort of drive creativity. So it's the necessity of competition that help what we would say people to innovate nowadays. So that's the third one. So play, meaning, and competition. The fourth one is design. So which is very much linked to the competitive process. But sort of when you have a problem, design comes out of a problem or a challenge or a puzzle that you're trying to figure out. So they said that there's no, if you don't have a sandbox, you do not have a sandbox if it doesn't have boundaries. So you have limited resources, you need to accomplish something, and then you come up with something new, and that solves that problem. So that's also one way to look at creativity. In management, we've talked a lot about design thinking. We even teach it at McGill at the moment, and so on. Well, then the fifth one is craft. So creativity is something that's like, when you go to a concert and you hear a violinist play a violin concerto, say Sibelius, and they, there's something that's deeply technical, sort of something that the person has to train their whole life to execute. But then also they're sort of, they take liberties within those boundaries. Or if you go to see a great jazz musician play at the Upstairs Jazz Club here in Montreal, there's a craft, there's a practice that people develop, and sort of creativity is understood against that craft. So it's a skill that you employ to be creative. And then there's this final thing. So if you have play, meaning, competition, design, craft, and the final aspect or foundation is the best word that I've been able to come up with is collective. So there's creativity happens in collectives. Say there's creative movements, artistic movements, or there are kind of golden ages that sort of emerge in certain locales.
Okay, so that was a lot to take in. So a quick recap. The 6 pillars of creativity are play, meaning and identity, competition, design, craft, and collectivity. And as you're going to hear, these categories are not distinct from each other. They can combine in different ways depending on what you're working on and even who you're working for or with. But first, Saku gives us an overview of how we can cultivate our personal sense of creativity. So, all right, let's get back to it. But yeah, no, that's super fascinating because I feel like all of those things can kind of play together in this very sort of the boundaries between those things are very porous. You can, so we're naturally a creative species. We have a desire for expression when we're in a context to do so. We're competitive, and we could trace that back to when we were fighting over food. But but the practice of creativity, I feel like that feels elusive to some folks. Maybe we could chalk it up to stress, or we could chalk it up to being too busy. But you teach a class, so I don't know. How do you get your students to start moving towards towards the practice of creativity, to incorporate it into their lives and into their work?
Yeah. So, well, there's several ways. So I really draw the distinction between kind of the academics of that class. So out of all these 6 foundations, we read academic literature. So we try to conceptualize, these different foundations. Whether or not that's very helpful for actually being creative, I don't know. I have to believe that's the case because we're in a university and that's how we roll. But on top of that, sort of there's always a creative assignment on each class. So, we've written, I gave them a rhyming dictionary online and they had to write a poem. And there was a sort of individual and collective component where they had to first, create individually and then sort of negotiate collectively on what that poem would be about. But then there's also, they have a noticing assignment. So each week they have to notice things each day. So they have to write down sort of unedited experience, in a sense that, when they're just paying attention to whatever is around them without judgment and without trying to control the experience. And actually, they submit a journal entry each week, and that's going to lead up to a final paper. But it's actually pretty beautiful. So you're not controlling yourself, trying to sort of, put boundaries on your experience or expectations on your experience or judge immediately what you experience and enact some sort of, knee-jerk response. But you're just sitting on a park bench and sort of watching kids play on the park or whatever. There was a beautiful description of one student watching her sister do her hair, it's just amazing how this almost lyrical quality emerges without any further instruction.
Yeah, and it's almost like we're a prism, and we're taking our experiences and the world around us and we're processing it. So I imagine everything that you got in terms of submissions would have been kind of reflective of who that person is, that student who noticed her sister braiding her hair. I hear that and I hear a deep compassion maybe for her sister, or noticing and caring. There's something kind of nice and intimate about that.
Yeah, and it's funny because this student was began the class by saying that they feel like, because they're an engineer, that they're not creative, that this is very hard on them. And then there was really sort of this very, first of all, it was beautifully written, just in terms of the language that was used, but also there was this loving quality, and that's quite something. So that's something what poets and novelists are aiming to do. And this was just of course, we have very talented students here. I'm not surprised, but also the assignment was pretty simple. That you just have to pay attention.
So, all right, I hope you're keeping up so far. So we've covered the 6 pillars of creativity. We've talked about how creativity can be cultivated and how it involves noticing the world around you, not judging your own experiences, and channeling them into your work. So in that way, anyone can be creative. So now, in this next part of the conversation, we're going to get into what this can look like in the workplace. So, we are at a management school. We are training students to go out into the world and to make their mark. And a lot of them are going to end up at various companies and institutions. But I don't know, do organizations value creativity? Even if they say they do, through their actions, do they walk the walk? Is there a space for that kind of thinking?
So I would say that they value it much less than what they claim. So that the space for creativity or true innovation even is much more narrow than what companies express in their rhetoric. And the reason for that is that creative individuals are often disruptive, and companies are still often pretty standard bureaucracies that are created to be reliable, predictable, and they work by socializing people into work roles, and they're not supposed to depart from the practices that are there. Innovation is, and sort of it's essential for the survival, long-term survival of any company in so many different ways. Those that actually run it are not necessarily well liked. Sort of it's a school of hard knocks to try to convince your colleagues to do things differently. So in a sense, I think, it's incredibly easy to talk about innovation and creativity. Those are obviously 2 different things, but, enacting them is much less pleasant than we often give credit to. And there's just, solid scientific research that actually sort of deviance and innovation are actually pretty close correlates.
Yeah, that's it. And I guess, so then how do you, or should we try to change that? How do you create an environment where you can create a safe space? Going back to that notion of safety, for creative people to start bringing their ideas to the table. And yeah.
So actually we have a PhD student here who studies, that there's a concept in anthropology called liminal space. Do you know what liminality is? Have you heard of liminal space?
I'm familiar with the term, but you might have to help me with the definition.
Yeah, so it originally was introduced, like in traditional societies, there was often, these transition points in life. For instance, becoming an adult. And there were rites of passage that you engaged in to move from one stage in life to another one. And then what lay in between was so-called liminal space. That's sort of where there was, there were sort of these rights and perhaps tests and challenges, but also that there was space to kind of to explore and adapt and change. But the idea of liminality in organizational life is that it's perhaps one of the easy ground rules is that you can open up different venues where creativity is possible. And, often kind of formal roles are lessened, sort of, authority and status is kind of, alleviated in these spaces. And also the expectation to deliver something that's ready and smart might be alleviated. And there are ways to create, these types of environments within the organization where people are allowed to blow off steam as well as then innovate. But sort of, expecting a company to be, or any organization to be constantly innovative or creative, there are such, I'm sure that, there are radical examples, but I don't think it's a fair expectation for any of us. That said, an amount of creativity arguably is essential for any type of work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, like some jobs are more conducive to that than others. Like, so I mean, I've always identified as a creative person. Like I'm also an amateur musician in my free time. I've done some writing, creative writing, and that kind of thing. And I'm lucky that my work has allowed me to use those skills in a way. Like I do some design for social media, and that's what, like, I've always been in marketing and communications type roles. But something I've noticed is that you always have like a communications director or an editor, and there's a hierarchy there, and there's an artistic vision maybe for the publication or for the brand or the organization, and then maybe there's room for creativity for the people underneath, but it's still in service of the vision of the person who's leading. So I'm just curious how you think about that, because like maybe there's an opportunity to learn there, but also maybe there's fewer opportunities for self-expression and contribution.
Yeah, so well, it of course depends on what type the organizational theorist here sort of awakens, and sort of we have to ask what kind of an organization are we dealing with. If we're dealing with a firm in particular, we have to understand what that social entity is. So it's written in legislation that the average organization, their purpose is to create returns for shareholders, except something else is indicated in the charter, but typically there isn't. So the firm is a profit-making machine. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the labor contract is basically then specifying that the person is selling their time to do pretty much whatever that profit-seeking entails. Of course, there's a lot of stuff in between nowadays. There's a lot of culture in between, and sort of extractive approaches to labor contracts don't often deliver very profitable results, but sort of it's not in the interest of any corporation to purely sort of enable people to be creative. So it's not necessarily that unlimited creative freedom is what we look for. So it's just that having constraints, but also sort of if you're working with others, you can be inspired by others, and sort of you can learn from your director's artistic vision, and sort of that it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's just that it is in the basic interest of no company to enable their workforce to be creative as a primary objective.
Yeah, it's interesting because it almost sounds like probably depends on the organization that just which of these 6 elements of creativity they value, because like maybe play doesn't fit everywhere. Like Google can have play. Like they have their ping pong tables and, and they create, and I might be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure they allowed every employee to have a certain amount of time to just do whatever they want. So, but I don't imagine Ford being able to do something similar because the culture is probably different. The brand is different, and maybe they value more the design thinking or the more problem-solving element of creativity. I don't know. Does that sound reasonable? Or?
Yeah, and well, I was just reading. I finished the biography of Elon Musk, who is the center of a lot of attention nowadays. And sort of one of the things that he is that he was a very, very successful leader and an entrepreneur. His behaviors don't necessarily, resonate with our understanding of ethics or sort of leadership. If we want leadership to be something positive in the world, I'm not sure that's the case. It could or could not be. Sort of we can debate that, but he clearly was effective. So he managed to build these enormously successful companies. And when he bought Twitter used to be a very focused on sort of I think they had a day, a kind of a rest day a month. So you got a day not for advancing a project, but just kind of psychological rest. And one of the first things that Elon Musk was asked when he came in, he was asked that how are you going to advance the psychological culture of psychological safety that we've had here? And he said that I'm not big on psychological safety, I'm big on the hardcore. So it doesn't sound very playful to me. Whether or not the company was big on play, or what kind of play was that? Sort of, I guess there is playfulness that emerges under very high stress conditions as well, and you find there's self-selection, and then there's a certain personality type that kind of flourishes under those conditions when there's high risk, high reward, and you're inspired even though it's not safe. Then sort of people still play. I don't know. But companies, of course, they have very different cultures and so on.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Saku, I think that's it for my questions. I think I learned a lot about creativity. I'm hoping that our listeners have pulled something out of this, are inspired to go and cultivate their own art of noticing, their own practice of creativity, and I hope that it encourages them to reflect about how they incorporate creativity more into their own life and their work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was fun. Thanks, Eric.
All right, and that's the show. Are you feeling inspired to be more creative? Let us know. Drop us a line on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram, or send us an email at delve@mcgill.ca. So thank you so much to Professor Saku Mantere for sharing your expertise today. This episode of the McGill Delve podcast was produced, hosted, and edited by me, Eric Dicaire. Saku Mantere is McGill Delve's editor-in-chief, and he produced all our original music. Like I said, he's a creative guy. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.